This week, we're reminded of Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 14. Peace, peace, when there is no peace. Details of the Memorandum of Understanding announced by Iran and the Trump administration in the United States have slowly emerged, and although there's obviously still a few loose ends to tie up, the initial picture does not look good. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina posted on X that he was somewhat concerned that Iran's view of the agreement seems different than what the American negotiating team is claiming, and that's how a lot of us feel. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Before we dive into the news, I want to wish a happy birthday to President Trump this last week, who turned 80 years old on Sunday. It was also the birthday of Vision for Israel, which was founded 32 years ago on June 14, 1994, although it seems like only yesterday. Last but certainly not least, I want to wish a happy birthday to the United States Army, which was founded by an act of the Continental Congress on June 14, 1775. Now let's dive into the big story this week. President Trump posted on Truth Social early last Monday morning that, quote, "The deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is now complete. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow," unquote. Officials from Iran's regime, as well as Qatar and Pakistan, who helped broker the negotiations, confirmed that a final draft of the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, is scheduled to be signed on Friday in Switzerland. This, of course, is meant to end the active kinetic conflict between Iran and the United States and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The specific points of this agreement are not being fully revealed to the public at this time. As I said in the introduction with the quote from Senator Lindsey Graham, the Iranians are insisting that the deal includes certain things that the White House is not confirming yet, and vice versa. Israel's biggest concerns in this area, and mine as well, are the reports that Iran believes its ceasefire with the United States extends to a ceasefire in Lebanon and a complete Israeli withdrawal from that country. There is absolutely no logical reason why this should be allowed, but apparently the Iranians think it's perfectly reasonable, and reports indicate that they were able to talk the Trump administration into agreeing with it. President Trump himself reacted to Israeli strikes on Hezbollah positions in the Dahia neighborhood of Beirut last Sunday, which were in retaliation for Hezbollah's drone strikes on Israeli communities in the Galilee, by saying that Israel should stop all strikes on Hezbollah. Also, he once again cursed out Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying he had no judgment and so on because these strikes had irritated the Iranians and endangered the deal. Now, to switch briefly to commentary mode, I must with all due respect say that there does seem to be someone in this situation whose judgment I'm starting to have very serious questions about. But it's not Prime Minister Netanyahu. If the Iranian regime, which has been beaten so badly on the kinetic battlefield and which is so nearly broken and bankrupt, which has lost all credibility with its own people and with the international community, is setting the terms of these negotiations, something has gone terribly wrong, my friends. To use President Trump's own vocabulary, the Iranians don't have any good cards in this situation except their ability to scare maritime insurance companies into not sending their crude oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. The military forces President Trump commands can take even that one card away from them. It would be difficult, bloody, and expensive, but it could be done. And the IRGC regime, which has now taken over from the previous regime run by the Shiite clergy, could be removed. That would be great. In other words, this war could end in victory for the United States, Israel, the moderate Gulf Arab states, and the civilized world in general. It doesn't need to end in a draw, in which both sides can claim some successes and some failures. The big failure Iran is reportedly going to be forced to swallow in all this is a completely meaningless promise not to pursue nuclear weapons in the future. There are also some reports that they will turn over most of their enriched uranium and once again promise not to enrich anymore. In return for this and for reopening the Strait of Hormuz to unfettered maritime traffic, something they can reverse almost any time they want, they are getting all kinds of goodies. This reportedly includes an immediate receipt of billions of dollars, essentially tribute money that will be taken out of frozen accounts in Western countries and transferred through banks in the United Arab Emirates. This is money Iran will get right away before negotiations towards more long-term issues even begin. In addition to that, the sanction on Iran's oil exports will be gradually lifted, which means they no longer have to give their Chinese and Indian customers any discounts, although it will probably still be a long time before any new customers are ready to do business with them. Iran also seems to think the purpose of the negotiations they will be conducting over the next few months with the United States are basically meant to codify and solidify the end of the international sanctions regime on their economy. It appears that they think this is a perfectly reasonable expectation given their glorious military victory in this conflict. Now, if all this seems more than a little surreal to you, I assure you, you're not wrong, and you're not alone either. The Iranian regime is severely out of touch with reality and sinking ever deeper into a morass of lies, deceit, gaslighting, and hypocrisy. Sadly, they're not the only governing regime in this world that is like that. And that is why it's so important for you and me to stay focused on our true King, the Lord Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach Adonenu, Yeshua. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Now remember, He is in control. He is coming back soon to rescue us from all this nonsense. And we need to not just believe that, but live like we believe it. This is a news broadcast, not a sermon, but I can't fail to mention this because otherwise none of this news I'm reporting will make any sense. Speaking of which, I also need to briefly mention the ongoing battles the IDF is fighting against Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. These battles are continuing to produce casualties amongst IDF soldiers and our own civilian population. And although the terrorist groups are suffering many more casualties, they are far from defeated. Now, this past week, Hamas did suffer a somewhat serious diplomatic defeat when the United Nations published a report giving some details about their abuse of Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. Now, this report might change a few minds here or there, or at least maybe it'll help some people who have talked themselves into believing Hamas are the good guys, but that's too little too late. The plan President Trump put forward last spring for Hamas to be disarmed and Gaza to be rehabilitated has gone absolutely nowhere. I was shocked this week to see a picture of poor old Tony Blair in the newspaper because he's once again being called upon to breathe some life into this process. I don't believe he can do that even if he's willing to, but at this point it's almost not even apparent that it doesn't matter to anybody anymore. Gaza, for better or for worse, has been almost forgotten by everyone. Hezbollah, which we thought we could forget about because they'd been so badly defeated in past rounds of conflict, is somehow managing to make a comeback, and they might end up being more dangerous than ever. They still have a large arsenal of rockets, missiles, and drones they can fire into northern Israel whenever Iran orders them to or they decide to. That's why here at Vision for Israel, we never stopped providing bomb safety shelters to communities all over the country. We're also continuing to provide equipment and supplies to medical first responders, firefighting teams, and even the police. So please visit our website, visionforisrael.com, and watch this short video. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas. And Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. In Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Now moving forward, the big related story that can help us understand why so many countries around the world are prepared to let Iran get away with so much mayhem and terrorism can be summed up in one word, and that word is oil. O-I-L. The price of Brent crude fell to $83 a barrel, while West Texas Intermediate fell to $80 a barrel in early trading on Monday following President Trump's announcement that a ceasefire in the war with Iran had been agreed to. These oil traders weren't interested in the diplomatic details or even the very possibility that this ceasefire could be short-lived. Like a man who has been underwater too long and manages to break the surface for a few moments to take a deep, gasping breath of oxygen, they can only think about one thing. To be fair, some analysts are trying to be sober-minded about this, warning that it is very likely to take many months and possibly even years before the mechanism for producing and distributing energy around the world returns to what used to be called normal, if you can call anything normal these days. Now, by the way, in case you aren't aware of it, most of Israel's oil supply comes from Azerbaijan by way of a pipeline that runs to the southern Turkish port of Ceyhan. This is a major vulnerability for Israel because if Turkey wanted to stop allowing Israeli oil shipments to be loaded at this port, they could easily do it on almost any pretext. They could say they need to conduct safety inspections or whatever they wanted to say, and there'd be nothing Israel could do about it. So this is something to add to your prayer list. Believe it or not, if you're praying for Israel, this is one more point to pray for. Now, I want to speak briefly about something that seems to have been forgotten in all this, and that's the terrible conditions that ordinary Iranians have to deal with. In January, when the regime was butchering people, murdering people in the street, President Trump said help is on the way, and a form of help did come a few weeks later. But as the war dragged on, and then the Strait of Hormuz closed and all the rest, this reason for the war being launched seems to have been put to the side. I think that's a mistake, friends. I think the United States State Department should be talking about this issue all the time. But since they're not, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. First of all, despite the war and the blockade and all the rest, the IRGC regime is continuing to execute political opponents at a furious rate, including several people who were arrested during the protests in January. People are being arrested and sentenced to long terms in prison on the slightest context, including liking social media posts that are critical of the regime in any way. Iranian human rights organizations, almost all of which have their headquarters in American or European capital cities, are reporting literally thousands of cases of ordinary people in Iran being arrested, tortured, disappeared, and executed. The crimes these people are supposed to have committed are usually very low-level acts of what we in the West call dissent, or free speech, or something along those lines. In Iran, they are considered treason and even crimes against God, and are thus worthy of the death penalty. Now, to their credit, the self-described human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which routinely demonize Israel, often on very thin evidence, have been consistent in their condemnation of the Iranian regime's deplorable actions. All of these activists, who we see waving Iranian and Hezbollah flags at anti-Israel demonstrations in Western cities, are no doubt aware of the fact that the regime is guilty of far worse crimes against humanity than anything they're accusing Israel of. Their hypocrisy should be a major turnoff to all these idealistic young people who are always talking about how important authenticity is and how everyone should be real. But it's not a turnoff, and I think the reason for that very simply is spiritual blindness, which is caused by demonic oppression. Most human beings have the capacity for critical thinking, rational reasoning, and problem solving. Whenever you see people not using this capacity, but nevertheless deeply committed emotionally to an irrational thought, it's probably because they're under spiritual oppression by demons. Now, my mentor, Derek Prince, talked a lot about that subject, and I commend the large library of his sermons, books, and other materials that are available online, mostly for free. Now, I promise you that you'll never regret the time you spend consuming these materials, but for now, I'll simply say that demonic oppression and possession is very real, and I see the signs of it everywhere. It's much worse and more widespread today than it was even just a few years ago. Of all the signs that are visible in the world today that let us know that we're close to the end of this age and the second coming of Yeshua the Messiah, that might be the most overlooked but also the most unmistakable sign if you know what to look for. Now, I could go on for a long time talking about that subject, but I want to move on to another topic that's very important for anyone who has a heart for Israel to be aware of, and that's the increasingly difficult economic situation here. First, let us look at some good news for a change. The Employment Service reported this past week that the number of people in Israel actively looking for a job had fallen to about 180,000 by the end of May. That number is down sharply from previous months, and it indicates that we're coming close to the optimal range of unemployment, which is between 4 to 6%. Now, considering all that we've been through here in Israel over the past several months, that's a pretty good piece of news. Employment Service Director General Inbal Mashhash said, "The Israeli labor market is proving once again that it knows how to recover from crises. The return to routine is not the finish line, it is the starting point. Now is the time to prepare Israel's labor market for the era of artificial intelligence and to ensure that reservists and their families do not pay a price in employment for serving us all." Well said, Imbal, and on that subject, I need to briefly touch on an event that is happening in Paris this week, the Eurostatory Defense Expo. AI-powered weapon systems have already been used extensively in the war against Iran, and they've also been used in Ukraine by both sides. The CEO of this Defense Expo, which is the biggest such event ever held with over 2,500 firms displaying the weapons and equipment they have to sell, including, yes, some Israeli companies displaying battle-tested air defense systems, is a retired French army general named Charles Bedouin. He candidly told the Defense News media portal that this might be the last chance European armies have to make large-scale purchases of weapons in order for them to be ready to use against the Russian invasion of the continent he expects to happen by the end of this decade. That is really perceptive. He also said that AI-powered autonomous systems were in high demand at the show, adding that we're accepting the idea that we're moving more and more toward autonomous weapon systems. Friends, AI is here to stay, and I believe it will play a role in end times events. Keep your eyes and ears open, both physical and spiritual, and don't stop praying. Now back to the Israeli economy. The OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, issued its latest economic outlook report earlier this month. This report said, in part, that following the sharp contraction caused by the March to April 2026 military operations, the economy will rebound strongly. And that sounds great. But the same report also said the Israeli economy would likely only grow around 3.3% this year, which is certainly better than nothing, but it's not adequate enough. The report had some more gloomy projections, including that the Israeli government's budget deficit would rise to 5.3% of GDP and inflation would stand at 2.3%, which doesn't sound too bad, except that Israeli households already carry an enormous amount of debt and the cost of living is only going in one direction, up. And that is very expected to continue for a very long time. Another big economic story this week, which is neither good news or bad news, but rather a little of both, is the sharp weakening of the shekel against a basket of international currencies. The shekel is currently trading at just over 3 to the dollar, sometimes plus, sometimes minus, while the price of €1 is now around 3.5 shekels, give or take. I have no idea how this stuff works, friends, but according to an article I read recently, it involves the rise in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, reserves of precious metals held by the U.S. Treasury, the price of catfish in Louisiana, the price of dog food in Italy, and a bunch of other stuff. The point is, somehow or other, the value of the Israeli currency is weakening against the dollar, coming back closer to the historic mean average, and that's a good thing for Israeli exporters and households. However, the situation for ordinary people in this country, it's still very problematic, which is why here at Vision for Israel, which is celebrating 32 years, I told you already, we're continuing to assist families and communities in need. So if you want to know more about how you can help, please visit our website, visionforisrael.com, and watch this short video. During the holidays, most families gather around a full table. But for some families in Israel, the question is simple and painful. How will we afford it this year? With the gift of $130, you provide a holiday grocery card directly into a parent's hands, allowing them to choose the food their household needs with dignity. Not a package, not leftovers, but the freedom to shop for their own family. Last year, supporters like you helped provide holiday support to thousands of families across Israel. For over 30 years, Vision for Israel has worked directly with local communities and social services to deliver trusted on-the-ground assistance. Before the holiday begins, cover one family, make sure one more table is full. For most children, the first day of school is exciting. But for some families in Israel, it's overwhelming. Parents are doing everything they can, but school supplies are expensive. For some children, even a backpack and basic supplies are out of reach. No child should start the school year feeling left behind. Without help, many children will walk into class lacking what they need. This is the moment we can step in. For over 30 years, Vision for Israel has provided practical support to families in need. Your gift equips a child for success. $45 provides a backpack with essential school supplies. $90 equips 2 children. $180 prepares 4 children for the year ahead. When you give, you're not just providing supplies, you're providing confidence. A simple backpack can change how a child feels walking into school. Prepared, confident, ready. Every child deserves a strong start. Give today. Help a child walk into school ready to succeed. Sponsor a child today. Visionforisrael.com. Now, friends, we're almost out of time for this week's report, so I'll just briefly go through a couple of other stories making headlines in Israel this week. A demonstration occurred outside the private home of Supreme Court President Isaac Amit in the Jerusalem suburb of Mevaseret Zion last Sunday. This is the latest in a series of demonstrations by young Haredi men against plans to force them to enlist in the IDF like everyone else has to. Last Thursday saw disruptions to bus and rail lines all over the country, ostensibly to protest against the remand of 19 Haredi youths who had participated in a violent riot outside the home of Deputy Supreme Court President Noam Solberg earlier this month. Now, I said in last week's report that this escalating situation cannot be allowed to continue. The leaders of these Haredi communities must be held accountable for the mayhem they're unleashing. Laws are only laws if they apply to everyone equally, and no one should be allowed to use violence and intimidation to try and force everyone else to allow them to continue disregarding the law. More importantly, this country simply cannot continue to function if such a large percentage of the population is consuming government resources without also contributing something to the common good. That's what my children do, that's what my grandchildren would do, and that's what my wife and I do. Well, I could say a lot more, but let's move on to the next big story, and that's about the fact that the effort to bring forward the date of the new elections by a few weeks seems to have fizzled, and so we can expect the elections to be held more or less on schedule in late October. There was lots of chest thumping and rhetoric by various political candidates, parties, special interest groups, etc. this past week, but all of it is sound and fury, signifying nothing until we get much closer to the actual date of voting. So I'll spare you an exhaustive rundown. Instead, I'll simply tell you that the big story of this coming election is likely to be a three-way showdown between the incumbent Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot. Well, a recent poll showed that almost two-thirds of Israelis don't think Netanyahu should run for re-election, and that almost certainly includes many people who voted for him in the past. Will they still vote for him again, even though so many of them are tired of him and think it's time to give someone else a turn? I guess it'll depend on whether or not Bennett or Eisenkot can convince enough of them that they've got what it takes to sit in the big chair. I haven't decided who I'll be casting my ballot for, but I have decided who I'm putting my faith, hope, and trust in today and every day, and he's not a politician. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, to continue with the tradition of ending with some good news, the ceasefire of Iran means the United States Air Force will soon be removing its fleet of refueling tankers from Ben Gurion Airport, making room for all the passenger planes that will be needed to carry Israelis to their summer vacations and bring many more tourists back into Israel. I'm looking forward to seeing you here in the nation of Israel. With that, I'm Barry Siegel, and this has been another episode of the VFI News from Israel. Shalom, shalom.